Do you have a small parcel? And let's say what's a small parcel? Let's define that for a second. I work on client properties that are 5 acres, 8 acres, quite a few in the 20s and 30s every year. Half my clients have 60 acres or less on a single year. My average client, though, is over 100 acres. And I have several clients that are in the hundreds of acres every year. I've worked on properties up to 4,500 acres. And no, a 4,500 acre parcel is not a small parcel. But when you get to 500 to 800 acres, you still do not encompass the daily lives of a deer herd 365/7, even on a parcel that size. So when I'm looking at small parcels, I'm looking at any parcel that does not encompass the daily lives of a deer herd 365 days a year, because if your parcel does not hold that deer herd that amount of time, then your mistakes are costly. Your mistakes, whether you're planting, the way you hunt especially, that's always the lowest hole in the bucket, what you plant, the type of habitat you have, you don't encompass enough land to encompass your mistakes and have them not destroy your parcel. And even when you have 1,000 or 1,200 acres or 1,500 acres, although you could do the dumbest things in the world, you can still have a good deer herd, but it's still not going to be the best deer herd. There's always more you can do, even if you have a large parcel. There's a lot of people that I see, my neighbors in Minnesota, nearby, there's one that has 2,000, there's another one with 1,500 acres, there's several in the several hundred acre range. And a lot of times those parcels get big bucks simply because it doesn't boil down to maybe even how they hunt, how they manage a habitat. It's just big enough to encompass the mistakes. We all make mistakes. But when the parcel size decreases, you can't afford to make mistakes. So I want to talk about how you can explode the buck numbers on your parcels. And I've talked about this several different ways. So you can look at it. I have a lot of strategies for increasing daylight buck movement on your parcel. I have various playlists, advanced hunting strategies, and all of these will help you attract more bucks in your small parcel, build the number on your small parcel, help you have a better hunt, of course, and shoot more bucks. But really it's about your level of herd influence. And I want to talk about how you can influence these deer and how you can influence these bucks and what it takes. And just real briefly, you have to have fall food. I'll have someone say, and they're probably listening right now, they'll know who I'm talking about, but we have 600 acres. We've hunted it this way for decades. We shoot big bucks and we do nothing. You know what's really cool about that? Is that's just the bottom line as low as it gets. Meaning, you're at ground zero, you have nowhere to go up but up, and if you've done nothing to the land and you have a great deer herd, wow. Imagine if you actually worked on the parcel. I'm telling you right now, you'd have 2 to 3 times more bucks on your land. Your age structure bucks would increase by at least 1 to 1.5 years per buck on average. You'd have a lot more bucks to go around. You'd be actually the herd influencer instead of the herd taker. And I'm not seeing the taker as a bad thing. What I mean is deer just coming through, you shoot them, you have a good hunt, you enjoy it. And if that's what you want to do, that's fine. But it can be way, way better, way more than you even imagine. You have to have food plots. You have to have good fall habitat. And if you do, the cycle I see, and this is a good test to tell you if you have good habitat. Because what I see, and I see this consistently, if you have adequate fall habitat, adequate fall food, meaning it's there from October to January. Doesn't have to last any longer. It doesn't have to be there during the summer. In fact, it can hurt you if it's there during the summer. And summer habitat is not fall habitat. Summer habitat for mature bucks. Big bean fields, alfalfa fields, green fields, open shaded canopy. The exact opposite of the type of cover that they need during the fall. And that's why there's the annual whitetail shift. I coined that phrase many years ago, and it is so true when it comes to bucks. Does, as long as things are adequate, as long as they have high stem count for fawning, almost the opposite of cover that what bucks need during the summertime, then they'll stick around during the fall. I'll say it again. I know you've heard me say it a lot, but does that are here today are here to stay. And so if you have them all summer, they'll be there all fall. That is not the case with bucks. A familiar pattern that I see over and over again. If you have adequate fall food, adequate fall cover, and most importantly, you don't spook the deer out of that adequate fall food or cover, you actually hunt the property wisely, and you don't set yourself up to spook deer, especially consistently off food sources, then the number of bucks on your land will explode. Yearling bucks. What is a yearling buck? A lot of people throw that term around, yearling, and I've talked about this before. A yearling is not a fawn. A lot of people refer to fawns as yearlings, but fawns are a few months old. A yearling is over a year old. A yearling was born in 2019. I'm making this video in May of 2020. We'll have fawns dropping pretty soon. And this fall, there'll be fawns. And the yearlings are sporting their first set of antlers. They're about a year and 4 months old in the early part of the season. 18 months old as it gets into the latter part of the season. That's what a yearling is. That yearling, they disperse from their mother. That helps to combat inbreeding. There's other biological positives that come from it. But at some point, yearlings leave, sometimes as a fawn, but most of the time as a yearling, they leave their mother. They're kicked out of the herd by their mother. They're kicked out because of female social pressure. The last thing they want to do is go to your land that has big giant food plots and bedding areas that are dominated by does. You're not going to collect that dispersing yearling buck. He just left because of female social pressure. The last thing he wants to do is to come on your land with a bunch of does and fawns when he's dispersing in the fall, especially during October, November, and run into a bunch of does and fawns. He's just going to leave. They're going to be a bumper towards him. You're not going to build your buck herd. So if you manage the balance of does and fawns, it's important. You have to have adequate fall food and cover, and you have to manage how you hunt and the hunting pressure on the land. But I'll go through the different points at which a yearling might come in. A lot of times they're dispersing. This is September, November, January. Yearling bucks right here. They're going to find your property somewhere in here. End of November, December, they're dispersing. They'll often disperse for an average of 1 mile to 1.5 miles. Think about that. About 1 mile and 1.5 miles. What's interesting about that is the difference in summer range to a fall range of a mature buck typically is about 1 mile to 1.5 miles. Some guess, and it could be true, a mature buck is back in his summer range during the summer where he's fawned, different type of habitat, different type of food that might meet his summer requirements. He's familiar with that, maybe a maternal instinct where he goes back to that maternal bond, and then he goes to his fall habitat, typically 1 mile to 1.5 miles from where summer habitat. That explains why you don't see those bucks, folks, during the hunting season. It's not because they go nocturnal, it's because they're somewhere else. Hopefully on your property this fall. The yearling buck, first time you might come in, November, December. He has little food plots. He has food plots that are built in with the lay of the land. He has areas that you can call his own. He has adequate cover, adequate food. Maybe he's with a buddy or two, a small little brat pack where there's 2 or 3 yearling bucks traveling together. You often see that in December. They're dispersing. You think, I don't remember seeing that little odd fork before. They take up residence on your land because you're not overrun with does and fawns, and they stick. That's how you build a buck herd. That's why less than 5% of the parcels in the neighborhood typically have mature bucks on them that are daylight focused compared to every other parcel, because most parcels repel dispersing yearling bucks, not attract them. If you don't have separate food sources, you don't have separate bedding areas, you're not managing your hunting pressure well, and you're building your property with a lot of does and fawns, you're not going to collect dispersing yearling bucks. But the first time they show up is right here. What's pretty cool is when you get in those 2nd and 3rd year bucks, a lot of times the first time you're seeing those bucks is more like a window here. They're starting to come in maybe mid-November. End of October might be the first time that you see a buck. I've had bucks in the past that I've seen for the first time as a 2-year-old, and it was in the end of October. The next year, you're seeing that 2 to 3-year-old as a 3-year-old. He pops up the end of September. And what you notice with all of these is that the older they get, if you're managing the hunting pressure, you're managing the fall habitat to be adequate, you're making sure there's separation so you can attract yearling bucks, so you can attract bucks in general, you have enough depth of cover, you're not allowing a huge doe and fawn herd to repel these bucks, then they come onto your land earlier and earlier. But remember, that doesn't mean they come in July and August, because they need a completely separate habitat than they do during the fall. The earliest I see, let's say this is September, October's around in here. The earliest I see is the end of September, those mature bucks start to come in. You notice an ever increasing pattern. We had a buck that we first saw as a 4-year-old for 5 years. We had pictures of him. I missed him when he was 6. He got killed by a neighbor when he was 8 years old. He was never, that we saw or got pictures of with all our cameras on the property, he was never more than 200 yards from one camera location, maybe 250 at the most. that we had for years and years. He was always right there. And the older he became, the more consistent he became in his fall habitat, because guess what? Didn't have the female social pressure. It was more balanced. He had adequate food, adequate fall cover, adequate fall food, and it was a spot that he could actually stick to and stay. And by the way, we grossly and significantly manage our hunting pressure. And so that allows these bucks to stay on the land. And what you'll notice this familiar pattern right here. As they age, as he died as an 8-year-old, he died 200 yards from that camera on the neighbor's land. And that's the pattern that I see with a lot of bucks. You first get them here if you have those conditions. If you don't have those conditions, you not only don't get them right here as a dispersing yearling buck, but you don't get them as a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and older. And of course, the age is all relative. In some locations, you're looking to shoot a 2- to 3-year-old. That's the oldest you have. I've hunted in locations like that. When I go out on public land in Pennsylvania, if I see a 2- to 3-year-old buck, I passed up a 2-year-old this year. The next day, I shot a probably 3- to 4-year-old plus in that age group. I'm looking for that age group around my property, Minnesota or Wisconsin. I'm looking for more 4 to 5. I'll go, if I had a bunch of 5- and 6-year-olds, then I'd just stick with the 5- and 6-year-old. It's all relative. There's no certain age that someone should be targeting, and you should never talk bad about someone because your neighbor is shooting another one. And hey, just a quick point. If you have some 3- and 4-year-olds around, maybe even a 5-year-old, and your neighbor shoots a 1.5-year-old buck, really, is that a bad thing? Think about it. They didn't shoot one of those older bucks. So, celebrate it. Celebrate them if they shoot a big one. It was time for him to go. He was ripe for the picking. But either way, I don't really like it when neighbors get against neighbors for shooting a certain size buck. I have clients that get mad, and I really try to talk to them about that. When I go to a client trip, it's not just about, here's your land, do this, do it this way, plan it this way, thanks for the check, bye-bye. It's not that. It's a personal conversation the entire day about all things whitetail and a lot of personal stuff, careers, family, everything else. And when it comes to this topic, I'm very passionate about. If a neighbor's complaining, if my client's complaining about a neighbor shooting a small buck, I try to point out, well, how many bucks do you have? How old are they? He just shot one of the small ones. That means he didn't burn a tag on one of the older ones. Think of it that way. And at the same time, if they shoot a giant one, think about how you can manage the property better so that he stays a more consistent amount of time during the daylight focused on your land on an ever-increasing pattern throughout his years. It can be done, and if you're doing it right, this is the pattern that you're going to see. And what's really cool about this, I'll end with this, is that when a buck ages and he becomes that 3-year-old, if he's the oldest one in the neighborhood, or a 4 or 5 or 6, he has the ability to survive, to me, at a much higher rate than he did when he was younger. Of course, he's wiser. But what he does is he defines the amount of time that he spends in his core fall habitat. He relies on that cover. He feels safer in that cover. He feels secure. And because of that, and that cover that's kept him alive through all these years during the daylight, he relies on that heavily. And guess what? If he's on your land, he becomes so much easier to pattern. He's very aware of hunting pressure. But again, if you're designing your property and your hunt, even on public land, with all the strategies I talk about on this channel, then you're not going to spook him. Cool thing is, you can define his movements. You can pattern him. He becomes much easier to pattern the older he gets because he spends an ever-increasing amount of time in a specific fall core habitat. And I hope that this season, that fall core habitat is on your land, because then when you have the fall afternoon food source, when you have the daylight cover that mature bucks focus on, that bucks in general focus on, that allow you to increase the number of bucks on your land, then the cool thing is you become the true herd influencer in the neighborhood for the quality of the herd. Not only the quality of the herd, the quality of the biological portion of the herd, but the quality of your hunt and your own hunt. And for that, you should be given a pat on the back, because you're working hard on your land and you're actually influencing land. And that's where it's so different when someone just says, well, I have a good hunt, I don't have to do anything. More power to you. That's awesome, because you can enjoy your land. You don't have to do that much. But man, there's so much more potential in all of this. I refer to that as a 2 or 3 out of 10 property. Not relative to maybe a really high pressured Michigan property or New York or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Minnesota, whatever it might be, but relative to their own individual neighborhood and where they could potentially be. They're only 20-30% of the way there if they're not working on their food plots and their habitat on that private land. There's so much more that you can grasp, and this is a large part of it. And I want to see you do it this year. I want to hear about it. I want to hear about it in the comments below. Man, I appreciate you watching. I hope you've subscribed to the channel. I don't ask people to do that all the time. But hey, this stuff works. If you want to be a herd influencer, if you want to see the amount of time the bucks spend on your land increase, this is a good strategy to start. This is a great pattern to witness. And the cool thing is a great test. If you see this happening on your land, you're headed in the right direction. You deserve a pat on the back.